Laws, rights, how to protect our kids when a school contacts DHR or CPS, how to properly get help within the school system to prevent them from contacting DHR during an already stressful time, what would be the best way to support our kids while under the care of the school district. Number one is be very mindful that in most of our states, there is absolutely no consequence for mandatory reporters in getting it wrong, in interpreting things incorrectly. Even if they're malicious in their reporting. In most of the states, there are absolutely no consequences for that because we're trying to promote our mandatory reporters to not make judgments, but just if there's suspicions, to sit there and share it on, pass it on. Now, at the same time, where there is weak training for school staff is to report on themselves or report on their peers, coworkers that they see, and there's criminal consequences for them not doing that, and we have a frequent problem there. Um, I don't really see it. In fact, I see them frequently getting it wrong, passing on information about families. All right. But like I said, there's no consequences for that because they're mandatory reporters. But I'd like to see it equal on both sides because we're having a problem within the school to where I've got a lot of teachers and paras that are staying silent to the abuse that they see and the neglect that they see within the school setting. Okay. But as far as parents, number one, be mindful about what you're sharing and who you're sharing it with. Even if you believe that it's well intentioned and you're just trying to keep everybody in the loop, because that's where a lot of these problems stem from. These aren't your friends, guys. Okay, and they're not your counselor. They're not your therapist. They work in a school setting, and they're there specifically for your children. They're not there as babysitters. They're not there as there's all these things that I could sit there and tell you, but a lot of it is that there's too many families that share way too much information, and they get themselves in these predicaments that they wish they, in hindsight, would not have done. So be mindful because look, and if you're one of the families that abuse their kids, then I'm not speaking to you. Obviously, I'm speaking to the families that get caught up in these accusations or these suspicions that end up being wrong and misinterpreted, especially when we're dealing with kids with special needs. And I'm speaking to you that you need to be mindful about what you share and how much you share with regards to school personnel. They're not your friends. Okay, writing a state complaint. Okay, how do you do it? You write the state complaint. Every state's going to sit there and have a format or a template that you can use. Now, what would you write a state complaint on? And first, let me tell you there's a difference between a state complaint and a due process complaint. A due process complaint is assigned to a hearing officer, whereas a state complaint is internally investigated by the State Department of Education in your state. Now, what would be a good thing to write a state complaint on, or what kind of issues that you're having within your school would be good for a state complaint as opposed to a due process complaint? Good question. For state complaints, it would be procedural violations because that is already the duty of your State Department of Education. They are an enforcement agency or a monitoring agency under the federal law on compliance to the rules. So they audit the schools every few years to ensure that they're filling out the documentation, that there's proper number of people at IEP meetings, that they're following the rules and the procedure. Okay, so that is already in the purview of your state Department of Education. That's their job under the IDEA. What is not appropriate to have the state investigate is anything regarding educational harm or damage, which is what we call substantive denial of FAPE. It means that your child is entitled to a free, appropriate public education, and the school did not do it, your child stagnated, or they regressed. And if that is the case, I do not recommend drafting a state complaint because I do not believe that the State Department of Education and its employees are suited to make those kinds of determinations, especially because I don't consider them neutral in their interpretation of whether or not your child made substantive progress. And a lot of the people within the State Department of Education, no matter how nice they are and no matter how awesome they are still educators that came mostly out of the schools for which you're complaining about to work inside the State Department of Education. And so I like the neutrality behind it. And you need somebody impartial that doesn't have a connection to the State Department of Education, okay, or the local schools. And they do, unfortunately. But like I said, as a monitoring agent on whether they're following the rules, that isn't necessarily the same thing as whether your child was denied a free, appropriate public education, in whether or not they stagnated or regressed because the IEP sucked and was not developed in such a way that would be reasonably calculated to provide your child with a FAPE. That's a due process complaint. That's what I do. I don't delve into state complaints. I don't draft state complaints. Parents can do that. There's a template you can get, and it's an explanatory system. And what it typically entails in all 50 states is that they send your complaint to your local school system, and they say, hey, you need to respond to this with evidence in a certain amount of time. It's not like they send an investigative team over to your school to sit there and crack books open or interview people. That's if it happens, that's rare. Usually, it is just surely by the exchange of documentation, and then somebody looks at it and says, "Yeah, they did that, or they complied, or they didn't," and then they'll render a decision saying you need to be better with regards to your procedure in the rule following. But this is where I'm telling you, stay within the realm of the duty of the State Department of Education. The state complaint is there for that purpose. Are they following the rules and the procedures? But if you're sitting there saying, well, their violation of the rules and the procedures ended up resulting in educational harm to my child to where my child did not provide a FAPE. If that's the case, and that does happen, and you have proof of that, then a state complaint is not where you need to be. If it caused educational harm or damage to your child where they regressed or stagnated in their progress, that would shift over to a due process complaint with an impartial hearing officer. So a state complaint does have its purpose, it does have its place. Just understand the difference between the two. Now, this is something that I really go into and I explain in Advocate University. I'm sort of giving you the summary here, okay? Because there are a lot of nuances and there are a lot of complexities there. That's the reason I have the course. Um, so trying to answer that, this is where a lot of parents get it wrong and a lot of advocates get it wrong, to where they help parents whip off these state complaints, not understanding the purpose of each agency and the purpose behind these particular dispute resolution options. Stay in the lane for which each was designed. One is designed for corrective action if your child was denied a FAPE and created substantive harm to your child, meaning that they regressed or they stagnated. Okay, that's where compensatory services, remedial services, and overhauling the child's program with the right services, least restrictive environment, location of their services, all those things are wrapped into here. Okay, and it can include procedure. Are they doing things right? Are they convening meetings when they're supposed to? Did they deny you your right to full parental participation? But at the same time, any kind of denial like that has to result in the harm. If it's just a bunch of errors that they're making, procedural errors, they're not following the rules, but it hasn't necessarily caused harm to your child yet, state complaint all day long, baby. That's their job. That is their job under the IDEA to monitor for compliance the local school system's implementation of these rules. And I'm going to cut it there with those two questions and then do another video with the remainder.